Nestled down in a cozy little corner of Howard County hides this enchantingly quaint village that represents a significant part of Howard County's history. When one visits this small, old-fashioned town called Savage, it seems as if time has not touched it. Howard County's earliest history can be traced back to this area in the southeastern part of the county, now known as Savage. Records indicate that the first land grant in the county was obtained there in 1659 by Henry Ridgely of Devonshire. After the land was resurveyed by Ridgely in 1685, it was given the name Ridgely's Forest. Through the years, land grants in the area changed hands numerous times, and in 1759, Joseph White obtained his own land grant and named it White's Contrivance, which included land that eventually became part of the village of Savage. The water power of the Little Patuxent River was ideal for the operation of mills, and several sprung up along the banks of the river in the 1700s. Alexander Warfield and Joseph White were just two of Savage's original mill hands.
In the middle of all this somewhere, I've forgotten the date, 1750-something or other, there was a reference to White's Mill. And that's the first knowledge we know of that anybody either had a mill or was thinking about a mill. And so that means that there has been a mill here for a very long time.
Events took place in the early 1800s that would forever change the face of the land in the Savage area. With the financial backing of Philadelphia businessman John Savage, three brothers named Williams established a cotton mill at the falls of the Little Patuxent River. George Amos and Cumberland Williams planned to harness the river's water power and use it to produce cotton duck.
The people who were building the future were surveyors. They were out in the woods and the forest finding out what was there. This whole universe, a new world. And this day, they were the entrepreneurs, they were the builders of industry, and that's what the Williams brothers were. And cotton was the coming thing at that time.
A three-story mill building was constructed in 1810 with stone brought from Europe. By 1825, the mill housed 1,000 spindles, 120 power looms, and 200 employees. Rushing water, captured by damming the river, was forced through a mill race to power the mill.
The mill was first ran by a huge water wheel, and that turned, if you know how the water wheels work, and then it's a wheel inside turning, and then there's belts put on that wheel, and it turns the shaft down here and up there. All through the mill, you got these shafts running with belts turning them and little wheels on these shafts, and it turned, and it was the power for the machinery.
A village sprang up around the mill, where once there was only a small rural population. Because many mill operations were light enough for women and children, historians believe whole families actually worked in the mill. As was the case in many mills in the early and middle 19th century, it is widely believed that the Savage Mill employed laborers as young as 8 years old. Despite the fact that John Savage never set foot in the mill's buildings, or in the village for that matter, his financial interest in the company was such that it was named after him, and in 1822 was chartered as the Savage Manufacturing Company. The Williams brothers had found an ideal location for the manufacture of cotton duck. Its close proximity to the southern cotton industry made raw materials easily accessible. Cotton was shipped to Baltimore ports, then brought by mule and horses down to the mills, where it was carted, spun, and woven into duck. In the 1840s and 50s, Maryland supplied the country's giant merchant fleets with the sails for their ships. Although the center for cotton duck manufacturing had at one time been in Massachusetts and New Jersey, by the 1870s, two-thirds of the nation's cotton duck came from Maryland. After John Savage died in 1834, the company began to decline. In 1853, his family brought suit against the mill for loans that were unpaid. Unable to come up with the money, the owners were forced to sell the mill's buildings and property. It took 6 years, but in 1859, William H. Baldwin, Jr. finally bought the mill at public auction for $42,000. Although the Civil War stopped operation right after the purchase, the new owners took the time to overhaul the mill and put it in good operating condition. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, life in Savage under Baldwin management was comfortable and pleasant. From the beginning, a village had built up around the mill, and with the coming of the Baldwins, most of the mill hands were able to live lives almost entirely contained within the community.
Everything was provided for by the mill. And they had a company store. The people would buy things there, materials to make clothes, beef steak, and charge it. Then they'd take it out of their pay when they got their pay. And their house, I think they rented for something like $2 and $3. And they had their own little fire department, ice plant, garbage collection, little policeman, blacksmith shop, well, anything. They had it all because we were off the beaten track.
In the early 1900s, the Baldwins built water and sewer systems and an electrical plant for the mill and the town. The Baldwin family was very involved in the town, and William Baldwin came to enjoy the town so much, he chose to spend his summers there and found a summer home for his family. The Savage Manufacturing Company did a booming business in the 1920s, producing duck for sailcloth, tents for the military, and surprisingly, the movie industry, where the cloth was used for backdrops. More houses known as bungalows were built for the mill hands, and in the 20s, a community hall with a library, bowling alley, and pool room were constructed and made available to residents. Despite the onslaught of the Depression, the factory survived and continued operating through both world wars, actually booming during the Second Big War. But by the late 40s, the machinery was getting old and obsolete, and the raw materials harder to come by. By Christmas of 1947, operations had suspended and the business shut down. The townspeople were forced to find work elsewhere, and the village of Savage was facing economic hardship. But by August of 1948, a hero had arrived to save the day. Businessman Harry Himes' forte was Christmas ornaments, and he moved his Santa Novelties Company to the Savage area with the intention of creating a Christmas village called Santa Heim Maryland. He bought the mill and its surrounding properties, including all of the houses and the community hall.
He had a Christmas store in the community hall. He fenced off the rest of the park down there and had reindeer in it. And even the little old post office down there had candy canes decorating it. And all the mill houses up that end of town, he painted different pastel colors and fixed them up.
Heim had factories in Baltimore and California as well as Savage, supplying the United States with 3/5 of the Christmas ornaments used to decorate the country. But Heim's image of a Christmas village outweighed his pocketbook, and in 1950 he was forced to sell the mill buildings and properties. The Weiner family bought the mill buildings and property from Heim. It was used for manufacturing and warehousing for their National Plastics Company, based in Odenton, Maryland. From the beginning, it seems the Weiners had the intent of preserving the history located within the walls of the mill.
And they were advised right off the bat by some of the architects with the what were the new design methods of those days that they could probably be a lot more effective if they tore the buildings down and built a single-story warehouse. And fortunately, they decided that wouldn't be a good idea, and so they put money instead into not really renovating it, but at least fixing it so they could use it for their own purposes. And they did that from 1950 until about 1971.
Jay Weiner is presently general partner of the company that owns and runs the mill today. He was a moving force in the preservation of the mill as a historic monument. When he joined the company in 1971, manufacturing at the mill was coming to an end, and Jay's first task was to survey the buildings and work with the Historic Trust in beginning the preservation process. By 1974, the mill was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In late 1984, the first hammer was swung to begin the renovation process of the old mill buildings. It was 2 years before the first finished building, the new Weave Room, was open to the public, with specialty and antique shops lining the walkways. Since that time, several other renovated buildings have been added to the updated historic monument.
The mill has about 110 quality antique dealers from all over Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. They all have other shops someplace and have brought a limited amount of things here, but it's always rotating. That's what's kind of nice about it. There's always new things coming in from their other shops. We have about 25 specialty shops and craftsmen, and then we have 40 artist studios. So those are open 7 days a week from 10 to 5:30, and you can see people doing neon art or pottery or weaving or portrait painting. There are many, many activities going on all the time here.
This Iron Truss Bridge, stretched across the river just behind the mill, lends its national fame to the mill town's history. When the Savage Manufacturing Company first began operations in the early 1800s, essential raw materials were shipped from southern ports to Baltimore and then hauled over land to Savage by mules or horses. With the advent of the railroad in 1835 and the building of the line from Baltimore to Washington, cotton was shipped by rail car to the Savage Station and hauled to the mill from there. A spur was eventually constructed from the Savage Station to the mill buildings to enable better transport of materials. Although a masonry arch bridge first carried the line over the Little Patuxent River, it was replaced in 1887 by an iron truss bridge designed by Wendell Bowman of the B&O Railroad.
This bridge presumably was built on the main line somewhere. By 1887, it was too light for main line service. Locomotives had become too heavy for it. So the bridge was indeed dismantled and replaced by a heavier bridge. The pieces brought to Savage and re-erected here on this light branch line that simply served the Savage Mill.
Although 100 Bowman-designed bridges were built throughout the United States and Latin America between 1852 and 1873, the Savage Mill Bridge remains the only one standing today. In September of 1966, the B&O turned the bridge over to the commissioners of Howard County. It has since been recognized by the American Society of Civil Engineers as a national landmark. By 1975, the railroad tracks have been removed and the bridge made into a pedestrian walkway. Today it stands as a constant reminder of the innovation of the country's early railroad days. The village of Savage is full of physical reminders of its early mill days. In addition to the mill buildings themselves, many original structures still remain. Carroll Baldwin was president of the Savage Manufacturing Company from 1905 to 1918. After his death in 1921, his sister Sally Baldwin and the company erected a community hall in his honor, set on the corner of Baltimore and Foundry Streets. It was built from stones brought up from the river by horse and cart. The hall was specifically designated for community use and remains so today, presided over by a board of directors. Although a small private library was originally placed in the building, the Savage branch of the Howard County Library System has been located there since 1966. In 1978, the county designed and dedicated an old-fashioned village green behind the hall, with walkways and benches available for all town residents to enjoy. Mill hands' houses line the streets of the small village as they did during the mill days. Built over a century ago for the workers of Savage Mill, most of these structures still serve as homes for the townspeople of Savage. But their look has changed. The duplex mill hand houses are now painted different colors and are missing the front porch, back porch, and white picket fence. At the top of Baltimore Street stands a house that seems to preside over the village, and at one time its residents actually did. It's called the Company House, and managers of the mill are said to have lived there. A large and ornate house located at the end of Savage-Guilford Road was the residence of prominent citizen Joshua Barney. Barney was a hero of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. He took possession of the house after a second marriage. For a short time during the early part of this century, the house served as an academy for boys. The structure has since been renovated and is a private residence today. Through the years, children of the town attended school in a number of different buildings. This Masonic Hall once served as the town school before classes were moved to a frame building across town on Savage-Guilford Road. A brick school building was erected at the corner of Washington and Foundry Streets in the mid-1920s, but before long that building was condemned.
It was built on a filled-in area, and the building began to sink. Over my desk, I taught there 3 years, first grade. Over my desk was a crack from the ceiling to the wall, and it was closed in March. 3 of us went to the auditorium in the community hall and taught there. Then 2 of the teachers came out here to this church in their auditorium room, and there was a portable room for the 2-year high school that another teacher taught in.
Shortly thereafter, a new brick building was constructed on Savage-Guilford Road. Children were then sent to Whiskey Bottom Elementary School in Laurel before the innovative Bowman Bridge Elementary School was opened in the fall of 1988 and the Patuxent Valley Middle School in 1989. Life in Savage today is a bit different than it was in the early part of this century, but some of today's residents remember the changes firsthand. Take, for example, Alice Phelps. She and her sister Myrtle still live in the house they were born and raised in. It was built by their grandfather and father over 100 years ago.
At first there was no electricity, only well water and an outhouse. And we took our baths in tin tubs. We only had stoves for heat. And later my father, who was pipe fitter, heated our house and put in plumbing. and we eventually had city sewer and water.
As young girls, the sisters' world revolved around the town of Savage.
I think we had a very happy childhood. We made our own fun. All the children of the neighborhood would get together and play hide and seek, and we played a game called Home Sheep Run, and we played baseball and jump rope and played marbles, and we even had a tennis court out here in the woods.
Although Myrtle and Alice never worked at the mill, their mother and a good part of her family did. After their grandmother was widowed in Virginia, she brought her 6 children to Savage, and she and 4 of those children went to work at the mill. Marion Matthews is probably one of Savage's most well-known residents. Although she did not grow up in the village, she traveled here to high school in the early 1920s.
Well, I was very naive because I was a country girl. And the girls here in the village had been talking with each other all their life, I guess. And I had to learn a lot of things. But I got along all right.
After eventually graduating from Laurel High School and receiving her teaching certificate from Salisbury College, Marion married her old Savage schoolmate, Bob Matthews, in 1934. They then bought the house she lives in today.
It was very quiet. Here it has always been quiet. And there was a large hedge in front of my yard. The one that's there now, we cut it low. And when I was here at high school, I used to walk past here, and I think, wonder what it looks like inside that yard. I found out because I have to cut it.
Mrs. Matthews raised 2 children here, daughter Marion and son Bobby. Bobby went on to become police chief of Howard County for a time. For over 15 years, Mrs. Matthews taught school in and around Savage. At one time, she even taught kindergarten in the dining room of her own home. After retiring from teaching, Mrs. Matthews became the librarian for the Savage branch of the library, and soon became affectionately known as Mother Goose.
Well, I was at the library, in charge of it quite some time. Circulation was very low because we didn't have the population that we do now. And I thought, well, we have to do something to have a bigger circulation. So I thought I'd start a little story hour, and the mothers would bring the children in. They'd take out some books and take some books out for the children. Then I thought, well, I should have a title. And I imagine, I can't remember, but I think I talked with some of the children, and they suggest that. So here I am, Mother Goose.
You can still find her carrying out this role at the Savage Library. John Gore and his family are indicative of some of the newer residents of Savage. After spending some time overseas in Navy intelligence, John was stationed at Fort Meade and brought his young family to Savage to live.
You've got real nice people, good people here. They respect your privacy, but at the same time they'll help you if you need help. And there used to be a school, it's now a private school here where my children could walk right up to it. And so at the school and, like I said, the small town environment and the surroundings and the people were the reasons that I moved here and stayed here.
The Gores set down permanent roots and became very involved in the restoration of the community hall.
It was in pretty run-down condition, so a group of us citizens got together and talked about trying to restore it. Fortunately, I don't know, or luck, I applied for the Maryland Historical Society down in Annapolis, and one thing led to another, and we got a $25,000 grant, and we were able to repair the hall.
If you visit Ma's Kettle on Savage's Baltimore Street, on any given day you may encounter Boo Boo Hackley. A regular at the restaurant, Mr. Hackley actually ran a restaurant from this building in the 1930s and dabbled in a few other enterprises.
Well, I run a restaurant called Hackley's Restaurant them days, and then I run a billiard parlor, and then I put out vending machines a little later. All kind of pinball machines them days.
Born and raised in the village, Boo Boo's favorite pastime was playing baseball, which he did even as an adult.
Well, I ain't bragging, but I got to play first base pretty good. I played that play for 27 years. And I used to play with the Coast Guard once in a while. They'd call me to come down and play with them. I'd go to Baltimore and play some. Played all around. I played in Laurel for the American Legion team a lot. We had a lot of fun playing baseball.
Ellen Woff and her family are relative newcomers to the Savage area. 13 years ago, they moved to Savage and fell in love with its quaintness. And 10 years ago, the Woffs bought an old farmhouse hidden behind some towering trees on a hill. They not only raise geese, but they take care of a horse and donkey as well.
The fact that we can live a lifestyle that you cannot live in this day and age normally. We have no central heat. We do have 2 wood stoves and a kerosene stove. How we have the animals outside. You really tend to live more outside than now if you were in an apartment or even in a well-insulated house, which this one isn't. You live on the earth, you live in the world, and I really like that.
Ellen and her family have adapted quite well to Savage, and in fact, she is currently president of the Savage Community Association, a group of residents who not only support fundraisers and town events, but work to see that Savage remains the quaint little village it is today. Mill hand's blood runs deep in Kenneth Gosnell's family. Not only did he spend time working at Savage Mill in his teens, his father, grandfather, grandmother, and great-grandmother worked there as well. In fact, his grandfather, Howard Gosnell, was manager of the mill when Ken was a youngster, and his father was a foreman.
My mother would send me down there when I was quite small, I guess about 6 or 7 years old, if I wasn't happening to be going to school that day. And I would take his lunch down around about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I'd carry it down there to him and go right on in the mill, walk right on in the mill. The machinery didn't bother me. It was in a cotton mill, lint's flying around everywhere. And it tickles your nose, and you're wiping your nose, and you think it's in your eyes, and some of the people would have cotton sitting on their eyebrows and what have you. So it's a cotton dust. And I didn't let that bother me. I went on in and found my father and gave him his lunch, and I'd walk around with him a little bit. And he would tell me different things about the mill.
As a child, Kenneth ran with the rest of the neighborhood kids. Their playground was an area on the river called the Rocks, where they would go swimming on hot summer days. A child's life in Savage was carefree and simple.
It's a wonderful place to grow up. We didn't have any fear. We didn't know what was a key. What do you use a key for? Lock the door? Why? We didn't lock doors. And we're talking about 1930, late 20s and the 30s, on up in the 40s. And we didn't have to worry about locking doors, leave windows up. I remember times Mother and Father, all of us would get in our father's Model A Ford and go off for a ride somewhere, and the house sitting wide open. You could walk right on through it. Windows up, doors open.
Life in Savage has been described as country living with city conveniences. Although Savage is in the center of a metropolitan area, its taste of country life is considered a gem by its residents. Today, many of the town's citizens travel to Baltimore, Washington, or nearby Fort Meade to work. But the village's sense of history is still very important to its residents. It's a feeling that townspeople want to keep alive. In an effort to do just that, Historic Savage Mill and the Savage Community Association sponsored an old Milltown picnic in June of 1990. The two-day event featured not only picnicking, but a parade, games, food, and entertainment. The event was an excellent way to help people from around the area learn about all that Savage has to offer.
The main purpose is to try to give a feel of what it was like back in the 1900s, to preserve what we have in terms of our history and promote what we have in terms of the specialty shops, artists, and things here now, but mainly to work closely with the community of Savage, and say this is a very special place. Let's pull on our strengths. Let's work together with the community and make it a fun day.
The sense of a small town atmosphere is alive and well here in Savage and available for all to experience. I hope you've enjoyed our trip through the village and its fascinating history.
I'm standing in front of the two new schools in Savage. Savage has been my home for 12 years, a place in my district which I'm very proud of. We have managed to keep the character of the old historic mill and the village that grew up around it, and yet adapt to the needs of the community. If you have a chance, certainly come down and have a look at Savage and see if you can imagine yourself back in time.